What the hell are you trying to do with those boxes, Gordon? She noticed. Sally one-eyed, she noticed everything. Just trying to get through the damn door. She jumped up and held the door for me while I struggled with the empty cardboard containers. Tony fired me. Just needed somewhere to put my stuff. I started pulling personal folders and papers out of drawers and piling them into boxes. I tried to only take what belonged to me and nothing that belonged to the company. He can't fire you. Without you, everything will fall apart. I didn't bother to answer her. Without asking, she started helping me pack. She noticed me grabbing a picture of my wife Laura off the table and throwing it in the trash can. Sally One-Eyed worked as my secretary for 2 years. I'll miss her. She had one glass eye that never seemed to be able to fall into place. It looked like it had a mind of its own. For some reason, it would often get watery, and she was constantly wiping it and popping eye drops in it. 3 years ago, Sally had been in a car accident. She lost her husband and her right eye. Now she had to work in that dank room to support her 2 young sons, Brian, who was 8, and Greg, 2 years younger. Gordon, what the hell happened? All you did was go home for another pair of glasses. He can't fire you for that. I finished packing the few things I had. I only needed one of the boxes. Tony Monsanto and Laura were lying in our bed when I got home. They weren't doing anything at that moment, but they were both naked. Did he fire you because you caught him sleeping with your wife? Not exactly. I told him to get out of my house first, and then he fired me. He didn't leave? Laura and Tony were still in our bed when I left. Tony was laughing as I walked out the door. Sally One-Eyed put her hand on my shoulder. She didn't say anything. I smiled and walked out of the building. The Monsanto Mowers Company will have to do without Gordon Livingston. I don't think they were worried about that. My brother, Shelton, wasn't home, but his wife, Joyce, was more than happy to offer her spare room. Shelton worked the early shift at the tire factory and would come home in the afternoon. Joyce delighted me with coffee and a warm shoulder to cry on until Shell arrived. After a quick lunch, we headed to my place to get my stuff. Tony was already gone, and Laura was sitting in the kitchen with some kind of drink. Why the hell did you come home in the middle of the morning looking like that, Gordon? I couldn't believe she'd asked me such a stupid question. I was afraid Tony might run out of condoms. I just brought him another dozen. Don't be a smart-ass. It's not that big of a problem, and it's nothing new. What does that mean? Tony was going to fire you 2 years ago. He agreed to keep you on the job if I had sex with him. I did it so you'd keep your job. You mean you've been having sex with him for the last 2 years? Laura looked at me with a slight smirk and finished her drink. Well, it wasn't that bad. You kept your job and I was able to spend time with Tony. Now that I've lost my job, are you going to stop seeing him? Don't be silly. Why would I do that? I couldn't believe what she'd just said, but it cleared up a lot of things. I looked at Shelton and we both went to the bedroom to gather my things. There wasn't much in the house that I needed, so it didn't take long. Since I wasn't very good with my hands, there weren't many tools or electrical equipment. The last thing I took out was the desktop computer. Laura had been sitting at the kitchen table the whole time. Somehow her glass was filled. She didn't say anything else while we were there. Laura was not aging well. She wore her hair long and dyed it a fancy black color. It looked kind of gothic or witchy. She had an olive complexion, but her face was thin, giving her a stiff look. Her lips were tightly pressed together, and she was looking straight ahead of her at the opposite wall, so as not to meet my gaze. I couldn't tell if she was mad at me for leaving or for catching her cheating. But it didn't matter. Shell and I stopped and had a beer to celebrate the successful completion of the move. It was a pathetic excuse to have a drink in the middle of the day. The house was a rental. Thank goodness for little things like that. It took about an hour to arrange for all utilities to be disconnected. I even got a few deposits refunded. Bank accounts and credit cards were next. I left half of the savings and checking accounts to Laura. When we got home, Joyce had a great dinner waiting for us. Later that night, Shelton helped me get drunk and put me to bed. The hangover was the first I'd had in years. I wasn't counting on severance pay from Monsanto Mowers, but I had enough saved in my savings account to last me a few months. Unemployment benefits were out of the question, so I would have to look for another job. First, I decided to take care of the divorce paperwork. That took all morning. After lunch, I went to the state unemployment office, hoping they would have something. "Hey, Gordon, it was nice to meet you here." Sally One-Eyed stood in front of me with a clipboard. "Did you quit your job?" "No, I've been replaced by some big boobs and big hair." I just shook my head. That was mean of Tony. Sally had nothing to do with this whole situation, and it wasn't fair to let her go. "What exactly happened?" "You were replaced by Tony's brother, Carmine, and I was replaced by Carmine's girlfriend. I was gone for the rest of the day." "I'm sorry. What can I do to help?" "Can I use you as a reference?" We both laughed a little at that. "Sally the One-Eyed Sally," and I sat together and filled out mustard-colored employment forms. I don't think either of us trusted the system, but we felt we had to go through the procedures. Before I left, I gave her a couple $100 and my phone number. She resisted for a bit, but eventually took it with a meek, "Thank you. A single mom with 2 little boys and no job is going to have a tough time." I spent the next week trying to find a place in the neighborhood that might be interested in hiring me, but to no avail. After receiving a scathing call from Laura about disconnected utilities, I changed my cell phone number. Simmons Farm Equipment was located about 3 miles out of town. Most of the farms in the area had been sold to developers. Ranches stood where corn used to grow. Everything about the place indicated that it was past its prime. It needed to be painted and new signs put up. The parking lot was in worse condition than the buildings. Even the windows needed to be cleaned. As bleak as it was, this was my last chance. Earl Simmons was well into his 60s and quite obese. He sat at his desk like Santa Claus without a beard. I was dressed for the interview, so he knew right away that I wasn't interested in buying farm equipment. "If you're not buying, you should be selling. I'm not interested." Can't argue with that. I was just looking for a free cup of coffee. My curt reply was rewarded with a barely audible laugh as he pointed to a coffee urn in the corner. I sat down across from my host, raised my styrofoam cup as a toast, and nodded. "Thank you. It's a nice ending to a bad week." Earl Simmons threw me a perplexed look. "Don't I know you? You're the same Livingood who works for Monsanto, am I right?" "Livingston. I used to work for Monsanto. I don't work anywhere now." After a short pause, "I never liked that Monsanto guy or his brother." We both sat for a few moments, neither of us saying anything, just enjoying our coffee. "Are you sure I can't sell you the Harvester? I can get you a good price on last year's model." A gleam appeared in his eyes. Maybe he was Santa Claus. I looked around the room. Outside the window, I could see a large warehouse and an even larger storage yard. There seemed to be no merchandise there. The showroom was completely empty. I assumed that because sales were low, he hadn't restocked. I didn't know a damn thing about farm equipment, but something was wrong. I was brought out of my reverie by his murmuring voice. "Sounds like you're thinking of buying this place. Are you going to make me an offer?" "In my dreams." Simmons leaned back in his chair and smiled. 7 or 8 years ago, Monsanto's operation was crap. He only started making money when he hired you. Is that true?" He was right, but there was no way I'd admit it. I knew what I was doing for Tony, and apparently other people noticed it too. All I could do was smile as I tossed the empty cup into the trash can. I was still smiling when I got up to leave. "Take your time, Mr. Livingood. Perhaps we can work something out. Livingston, Gordon Livingston." 2 hours later, Earl Simmons and I came to an agreement. He had big plans, but he needed someone like me to bring them to fruition. He was a frugal man, so money was not a problem for him. I was willing and able to help him, but with one condition: I could hire an assistant. One-Eyed Sally was to be a happy woman. That evening, I took Shelton and Joyce to the Red Lobster. The misery that Laura had caused was fading fast. I think Sally was happier than I was when I called her. When we got back to the house, Laura was waiting for me. She spent about 20 minutes trying to convince me to come back to our place. It turned out that Tony wasn't very keen on supporting his wife, family, and Laura. I politely listened to all her arguments, smiled, and walked into the house. I didn't say a word. The next few weeks were intense. The main building was constructed of concrete blocks. On the second floor was a 3-bedroom apartment that had been used as a storage unit for the past 20 years. Earl was more than happy to let me live in it rent-free. Sally, the one-eye, helped me find the stove, refrigerator, and washing machine. Sally and I cleaned and painted the office and apartment. I hired a couple of high school kids to paint all the outbuildings. Earl never complained about the expense. It was a lot of fun, but eventually we had to start doing productive work. Laura called Joyce to let her know that she had received and signed the divorce papers. It was pretty simple since we didn't own the house and we had no children. I had already given her half of the property. Not much for 12 years of marriage, but everything she deserved. Sally One-Eye was a skinny little thing with bad teeth and a false eye. She had dirty blonde hair and it looked like she'd never been to a beauty parlor in her life. She definitely lacked makeup skills. She always looked clean, but was in need of some serious grooming. All of this was offset by a honeyed voice on the phone and a work ethic that embarrassed me. Her computer skills were extraordinary, as was her accounting ability. She was a dream come true for me. It's nice to work for someone who thinks they are smarter than everyone else, but they usually aren't. Monsanto Mowers had no confidentiality clauses or proprietary agreements. Tony didn't need any of that because he was human. Unfortunately for Tony, it also meant that Sally and I had an open playing field. Sally sent out letters to all the wholesalers we dealt with and all the retailers we worked with. All she did was explain that we were both no longer employed by Monsanto Mowers and could no longer provide services to them. She was very careful not to ask for any business. At this time, I was calling all of Earl's contacts to see if any of them still existed. Most of the accounts had slowly died over the years, and some had gone out of business. For Earl, the farm equipment business was dead. He had no desire to revive it. I came across a Korean manufacturer who was trying to find American distributors for lawn mowers. They were not very sophisticated, but rugged and cheap. It was perfect for small municipalities and school districts. After 30 minutes on the phone, I had 50 pieces of equipment from California on consignment. We had the space to store them, and it didn't cost us any money. They sent a box of promotional brochures sent by express delivery, and Sally One-Eye was right on it. We had 6 orders before the first shipment even arrived. The next week, Sally started calling all the letter recipients. I don't know who was more excited about her calls, the wholesalers or the retailers. All she was doing was laying the groundwork, and she was good at it. We wanted to enter the residential lawn care market, but didn't mind a little expansion. Several rototiller companies tried to get Tony to supply their products, but he didn't want any part of it. By the end of the first week, I had 3 such companies. 2 of them were willing to work on a consignment basis. The showroom on the first floor was ready to receive the products. I didn't think it would be garden equipment, but Earl was thrilled. Sally One-Eyed surprised me by signing a contract with 2 chainsaw manufacturers. An old friend of Earl's arrived with a truckload of new chippers. He didn't mind making a consignment deal either. In no time at all, Earl had a whole warehouse of new merchandise. Monday morning, Earl introduced me to our new salesman. He was retired and wanted to work solely on commission. He said that if he didn't sell anything, he didn't want a paycheck. The first day, he sold 3 lawnmowers and a shredder. Business was picking up. Sally One-Eyed was so busy that she asked if she could go to work on Saturday. I didn't mind since I would be here anyway. There was no school or daycare on the weekend, so she had to take the boys to work with her. I always liked the kids. They spent most of the day in the apartment watching TV, but I think what they liked best was going with Earl to look for groundhogs. Sally said they talked about it all the way home. A few weeks later, Sally's boys were out of school for the summer. She took them to work with her every day. Earl kept them occupied most of the time in the backyard. The business was located on the front of Earl's old family farm, actually an orchard. The hillside was dotted with old apple trees, most of which were dead or dying. In one of the extra rooms, I put bunk beds for the boys. Just in case, I bought 2 single beds for the other room. It wasn't hard to convince Sally and the boys to stay the night. Since the nearby elementary school had high grades, I had no trouble convincing Sally to move in before the new school year started. Come to think of it, I think it was her idea. How did she do it? For proposing, I was rewarded with a little kiss. Things were looking up. Anyway, Tony found out where I was working. Carmine's girlfriend had been using the company computer to download pornography and had picked up a couple of nice viruses. Tony asked if I could come over and get the system back up and running. I think he heard me laughing as I hung up the phone. He was lucky I didn't sue him for alienation of affection or wrongful termination. Earl had used the company's health insurance for years, even when he really had no employees. When Sally found out that she now had dental insurance, she was ecstatic. She began spending time at the dental office once a week. At first, nothing was noticeable, but as the weeks passed, she began to look better and better. The dramatic change came when Earl made an appointment for her to see an eye doctor. All along, her problem had been a poorly fitting denture. When she got the right size, it became almost impossible to notice. Now, one-eyed Sally was just Sally. For her birthday, Earl and I gave her a full day of beauty treatments at the Elizabeth Arden Salon. I had to drive her to Philadelphia to get it done. The boys and I spent the day at the zoo, and their mom was totally spoiled. It was a good time. Laura called and asked for help. Her car was impounded, and her cell phone service was disconnected for non-payment. She moved into a furnished studio apartment and was no longer paying rent. I left her all the furniture from the house. I have no idea what she did with it. Tony refused her phone calls, and she wasn't allowed in the company building. I tried my best to be polite and understanding, but explained that there was nothing I could do to help her. She didn't like the answer, but there were no alternatives. There was still one more week until the divorce was finalized. I was counting the days. Now, we had hoped that business would start to move because of the retailers, but it turned out to be the opposite. Tornado Mowers was the first manufacturer to contact us. There were 9 retailers in the region who worked through Monsanto Mowers. They were dissatisfied and wanted a change. 6 of them knew about our new company and recommended that Tornado contact us. By the end of the day, we were the official wholesale distributors of Tornado lawn mowers in 3 counties. We had gotten our first real breakthrough. The next day, my divorce was final. After that, things went from bad to worse. One by one, wholesalers and retailers who used to go to Monsanto Mowers switched to us. Sally managed to hire a girl to help in the office. A few weeks later, I happened to hear a commotion near the equipment storage area. 2 men got out of a pickup truck and were pulling something out of the trunk. Moments later, 2 Molotov cocktails flew across the pad. The arsonists waited for the fireballs to burst into flames and then rushed toward the truck, but they were too late. No sooner had they reached the truck than 2 shotgun blasts rang out, and the front tires of their truck went flat as pancakes. I turned on the outside spotlights, and Earl stood there laughing. 2 shadows ran down the road damn fast. The police had no trouble finding the owner of the truck. He couldn't wait to lay it all out to the Monsanto brothers who had paid him for the job. That was pretty much the end of Monsanto Mowers. Their small customer base was taken over within a week. Tony ended up doing time in prison, but I don't know how much. Carmine disappeared. The damage to the property was minor and covered by insurance. Earl strutted around the house like a peacock, happy that his old business was thriving again. He had suggestions from time to time, but he always tried to stay out of it. We now had a site manager who acted as a Spanish interpreter when needed. One of our mechanics was a graduate of the local trade school, and the other was an old fart. They complemented each other perfectly. Sally became a payroll and tax specialist in no time. Shelton and Joyce came over about once a month. It wasn't anything special, but it was nice to meet someone. Earl lost his wife over 10 years ago. They had no children. He was always welcome when we had visitors. Laura seemed to have disappeared. After Sally moved in with us, we became closer. At first, we just sat and watched TV after the boys went to bed. Sometimes we would fall asleep on the couch and wake up snuggled up against each other. We started giving each other kisses, as if to say thank you for some small favor. Before I knew it, I was smacking her on the cheek when she and the boys went out shopping or something like that. In early December, Sally told me that it was time for Brian to get his own room. I, of course, agreed. That same afternoon, she moved all her stuff into my room. I should have seen it coming. After the boys went to bed, she took my hand and led me into the bedroom. I was embarrassed at being so drowsy and thrilled that she had taken matters into her own hands. The day before Christmas, the local justice of the peace quietly married us. We didn't tell anyone, but Earl saw the ring on Shelley's finger the next day. It was a good holiday. Business was booming. When spring came, Earl announced he was leaving for Florida. He had a sister living in Ocala who had been urging him to come for years. I was afraid his move would create a few problems, but Earl had everything under control. He turned the property and the business over to Sally and me. All we had to do was send him 10% of his monthly income until he fell off his feet. It was an offer we couldn't refuse. He didn't need the 10% because he had accumulated a good amount of capital over the years. It was more of a symbolic gesture so that we would always remember him. It wasn't necessary, but we understood. The farmhouse had a lot more space than the apartment. It took a month to repaint everything before we could move in. I never understood what Earl had against painting. The week we finally moved in, Sally found out she was pregnant. Brian and Greg were just as excited as I was. It was hard to imagine that just a short time ago my life was in complete disarray. It's funny how things work out. Hopefully the new baby will have 2 eyes.